What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the show. I am your host, as always, Cody Kaler. We have a great episode lined up for you today with a really good friend of mine and an industry leader, Mr. Ryan Leschber. Ryan is the Vice President of Operations for Fresh Freight. He's been in, I can't remember, about 20 years, but I think he's been in as long as I have in the supply chain. So let's go ahead and bring Ryan on. Ryan, what's up, buddy?
Hey, Cody. How's it going, brother?
Wow, it's going, man. How about you?
Hanging in there. Got through the holiday.
How far are you away from those floods?
45 minutes.
Oh, man. Did you guys get hit pretty hard with weather in general or not?
Yeah, it started raining like Thursday and didn't stop till yesterday. So we're not in a flood zone, so we were spared. But, I mean, it's terrible for everything else that happened so quickly.
Yeah, it's major tragedy. It's crazy to hear about that stuff in Texas. You don't think about flooding in Texas, especially like West Texas, right? It's all desert and dry out there. But
that Guadalupe River Basin is the most dangerous in the country.
Really?
Yeah.
That's nuts. All right. So Ryan, let's get down to this. So how about we just start with your background, then we can kind of go into Fresh Freight's background. But you and I obviously almost parallel each other, coming from the shipper side, moving over to the brokerage side. We'll get into that a little bit later in the episode about kind of the challenges of shifting from one to the other. But let's just start with you and your background.
Sure. So I've been in transportation and logistics for going on 20 years. I got my feet wet with HEB. It's the first kind of supply chain warehousing operation that I was exposed to in college back in the mid 2000s. I ran some of the seasonal grocery for them. I transitioned over to food service in late 2008. I worked for a food service company, private company here in Texas for 13 years, managed inbound fleet, equipment, you name it, anything with wheels we touched. And then in 2021, I moved over to retail, spent 4 years with Whole Foods, managed all the inbound perishables there. Then earlier this year, I transitioned out as kind of the last bucket to fill for the, kind of complete experience within logistics. So I did jump over to the supplier side from a carrier and brokerage standpoint. So now we're rocking and rolling on the brokerage, got fleet on the road, and here we are.
Yeah, love it. So yeah, you've been in here just as long as I have. You're one of the few people that I've had on here that can actually sympathize with me about 2008, 2009, 2010 because
Yeah.
all I hear about these days is like, oh my gosh, the market's so bad, so bad. I'm like, you don't remember bad. Like if you didn't live through logistics in 2009, I remember the company I was working for. We were about a $4 billion wholesale company. And we lost like 35%, like overnight. It felt like like volume, and it's like, man, I don't want to hear about what's going on in the market right now. This is just a little bump in the road compared to the shit that, if you've been through 2019 was bad, but not that bad. Like 09 was like Armageddon though. Like if you survive that, this is easy.
Yep. Agreed.
So
I was just getting into the industry then, with actual, like from a decision-making standpoint. But, I think coming from the food service side, the only thing that rivaled that for me was COVID, being in the food service space with, schools and institutional business being the primary accounts that shut off overnight. It's like, what do you do? Schools close. We've got 150 trucks on the road. Where do they go? So that fallout was pretty intense, but I would say relatively short-lived. And we've obviously seen what the market's done since. And, 21, 22 were pretty favorable for the shipper side, or for the carrier side. And then that's transitioned the last 3 years for the shipper side and kind of a, depressed market. But, that is part of what we do, right? We control the controllables is kind of the narrative I like to live by. And, there's only so much we can influence, and, we take it from there.
Yeah. It's not worth wasting your time and energy on shit that you can't control.
Absolutely.
Like, focus on what you can focus on. Cause look, I'm a big Jim Cramer fan. So like, I love his saying where there's always a bull market out there. Like you can be in the worst market, terrible, but there's always ways to make money in this market. And I'm a believer in that.
Absolutely.
You just got to sell your ass off, right? I mean, that's like, sales came easy. Like I feel bad for a lot of the brokers that got in here during COVID because they're like, oh my gosh, I made 10 calls today and I got 8 people that signed me up. And it's like, yeah. And nowadays it's like, I made 100 phone calls today and I got called, this word and this word and this word. And I got 0 yeses. It's like, welcome to how it actually really is.
That's right.
So cool. Well, so Fresh Freight, you mentioned that you guys are a brokerage as well as an asset company, but you guys focus mostly on perishables, right? So a lot
of yeah, over 60% of our volume is produce specifically. We are food vertical, so anything in the food realm we touch, mostly on the food service side and our retail partners. This company was established in 2016. Matt, the owner, Matt, I've known him for 17 years. He was one of the first carriers that I onboarded back in the old days, and we've worked closely together. This transition was easy, made sense. We had a really good working relationship. So came over as the VP of Ops just to, help kind of bring some of that strategic growth into the equation. Looking at scalability, tech and automation is a big factor and focus with the keeping up with the industry. So those are, kind of my primary responsibilities, although I, do oversee both brokerage and fleet. Very different, by the way. But we are produce. This is the lifeblood of our business, really.
Yep. Same here. So with that in mind, what have you guys been seeing out there with the market? Cause if you tune into, the DAT forecast each week, which is great information. Love Dean and his team over there. Obviously reefer's been pretty rough. I mean, they've been getting beat up this year.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and this is really not a new trend. Reefer freight's been far more volatile than van over the last 4 or 5 years. We've seen it, even without the seasonal norms that have typically been a factor, which is interesting. That seasonality did return a little bit with, healthy harvest and things out in California for produce season, getting into the transition this year. It's been a weird event, timeline of events with weather and other impacts that have kind of, held back quality or, volume from the produce side. But, I've lived and breathed perishable freight for the last decade. And so there's, very little that can surprise me. But what I do know is as soon as you think you've got it figured out, it'll change.
100%. And so I remember way back in the day, I started in logistics in '05. So we're talking 20 years ago, is when we started to see a massive trend, at least where I was at, which is just in the West. The company that I worked for, Associated Food Stores, we just handled 13 states in the West. We were starting to see a decrease in center store stuff. So cereals, your pantry stuff, and an increase in fresh. And so at that point in time, we actually saw, reefers starting to go up, vans starting to come down, because we saw a lot more health conscious people. But COVID, I feel like, completely reversed that, right? Because people weren't able to go to the grocery store every couple of days. I don't know about you, but like me and my wife, we go every other day or so, because fresh produce and meat, I hate it sitting in the freezer. I hate fresh produce sitting in the fridge for too long, right? So, go spend $20 or whatever every couple of days, just getting your fresh produce for your dinners and all that fun shit. But I think COVID kind of changed a lot of people's mindsets, because they were looking for more shelf stable stuff. And I think a lot of people got used to that after that happened. So I think that is contributing to part of it. A lot of the growers that I've talked to over the last couple of years have mentioned that they are seeing a lot more demand on the frozen side than they are so frozen veggies and fruits than they are on the fresh side. And to me, that's like, it was like boggled my mind. But then it made sense when you actually broke it down to people were going to the store and avoiding people at all costs for like a year and a half.
Yeah. Scarcity mindset too, right?
Yeah. Yep. So, and I think that a lot of people are still just in that kind of, they got used to buying frozen veggies and frozen fruit, right? And so, why buy strawberries when they're going to look like crap in 3 days in your fridge, when you can buy a bag of them for your smoothies, right?
Right. And depending on where you were in the country, like during COVID, I mean, you couldn't get into a grocery store. You're waiting in a line, you're masked up in the street. Like, that's where we saw that big kind of transition to delivered services, or, curbside pickup, those type of things, where anyone that didn't really want to go into a grocery store had other options. I think that stuck. I mean, we still see that today. We're pretty guilty of doing that ourselves, and we don't feel like going to the grocery store, putting an order, and it shows up on the porch in a couple hours. Like, it doesn't get any easier than that.
No, I remember going to my local Kroger here the first time and seeing one of their store pickers, and I was like, "What the fuck is that?" Right? and now I can't go in there and see less than 10 of them, and it's like that's a full-time job, and it's like, it reminds me of when I was an order selector way back in the day, and at an actual warehouse, just on a much smaller scale. You're picking a single case instead of half a pallet of shit. But it's crazy out there, man. So.
I was in a pretty unique situation there with the Whole Foods Amazon kind of relationship and partnership with the growth in grocery, and seeing that happen in real time was interesting as well, because you've got not only Whole Foods selectors, you've got Amazon, and competing for aisle space and pushing around big carts and filling up the aisles is, it's still around because it's a convenience factor that people will pay for. But at the end of the day, it's, I started in this space 20 years ago because the very first recruiter I talked to coming out of college was, asking, what is something someone does every day? And I, thought it was a trick question. I thought I was being set up for something. The answer was, you have to eat. Right. And so at the time, that really resonated with me, still does today. And which is why now, 20 years later, I'm still in the food space. Obviously more on a different side of the equation than where I started, but still at the end of the day, this is the industry that is pretty recession proof, particularly when, maybe quick service goes down, grocery service goes up, and vice versa, depending on all the economic factors out there that are at play at all times. Like, it's always going to be a thing, but they do kind of have a good parallel and a nice balance, because we all have to eat.
Yep. That's, I was in the same boat. I remember when I started at that warehouse, that was what one of my managers always said was, people always got to eat. Even in '09, it's like, people got to eat, right? They just change their habits, and they just, sometimes you have more disposable income and you buy the organic, $2 per pound strawberries. And sometimes you don't have that disposable income and you go buy the 99-cent frozen shit. So
that's right.
It is what it is. But so definitely, did you guys see much of a crunch through Q2 and the start of Q3, because typically, especially in produce, I mean, you know this just as well as I do, and we've been moving produce for 25 years now. You usually see that big run up from April to the 4th, and then you see a pretty big letdown after the 4th, right? And it kind of just trickles down into the start of Yuma season. Sometimes Labor Day can be, depending on what Labor Day and Memorial Day is so weather dependent. Sometimes it can be a boost. Sometimes it's just a dud. But did you guys see much of a run up for the 4th?
Well, I'd say we went through the gauntlet, right? In May, we had Mother's Day, had Blitz Week, had Memorial Day, all in succession.
Yep.
Huge food service holidays, both, you know, Mother's Day particularly, Memorial Day, and then you're starting getting into grilling season, right? There's some more demand for summer produce and grillables, like in the protein space. So, you know, we kind of survived that May rush. June for a couple weeks we saw a little tail off, things kind of return to normal as expected. This is not, I'm not, you know, changing the game here. This is all historical. And then, you know, I'd say last week of July, you see that ramp up for inventory for the holiday in retail and in food service. And, you know, as expected, there is some, you know, crunching of capacity it's particularly like regional markets, right? We'll see certain markets get really tight, and it's usually relatively short-lived. A couple days, you survive it, you get through it, you move on. So we did see that. I know load to truck ratio did jump to like 13-1 last week, and, you know, historical norm is 12. So I'd say adjusted for the holiday, knowing it's that week, it's probably not much of an outlier. But in terms of capacity and pricing, you know, spot volume jumps, you start to see some of the fallout for rejection rates and things like that leading into the holiday. I think we, you know, managed it pretty well because there is still excess capacity out there. Comes down to planning, right? Working ahead, staying ahead. And I would imagine that we see that drop off back to kind of the norm for the next few months, really. Like you said, getting into Labor Day.
Yep. Same here. We definitely saw a little bit of seasonality, but it wasn't as exaggerated as prior years, at least in our experience, especially California. The California market's been soft all year, right? The Southeast was a nightmare though. The last couple of weeks, that's been, you know, you got peaches and melons and corn and everything coming. It's probably going to be for, what does that run through the end of August? You know? So, you know, carriers out there, get your equipment over to the Southeast right now. I know normally you don't want to go to Florida because it's a dead zone. Right now's the time to get your reefers over there, guys. Short-lived, but make your money while you can. Yeah,
we had some contract rates in the Southeast, and we saw overnight they jumped from, you know, 800 to 1,000 on a short haul to 2,000 plus, like that. And you know, I think that'll last a few more weeks, and we'll get through it. It's similar to cherries up in the PNW. You know, we anticipate that disruption. You live through it, and in my opinion, cherries are the hardest thing to ship that there is.
100%.
They're very sensitive. You have to ensure temperature integrity. Lots of things can go on. Particularly, it's kind of ironic that the most, you know, heat sensitive item that there is, or commodity that there is, ships in the dead of summer, right? So it's kind of like a lose-lose situation. But you know, I'd say relative to that, once that quiets down, PNW's relatively soft through, you know, the start of Q4.
Yeah, October starts to really ramp up for Christmas tree season. And then, you know, anybody who's moved produce knows that Q4 is an absolute nightmare out of Pacific Northwest. But to your point, cherries are the biggest pain in the butt when it comes to produce. They're so sensitive, but also they're harvested and cooled that day. A lot of people don't realize that, literally within hours, right? And half the time the shed's not correct. The shed doesn't have your order. You got to move over here. You got to move over here. And yes, you know, the Yakima Valley looks like it's that big on a map, but it's really, you know, it's you know, moving your truck 20 miles here just to find out that this shed doesn't have it. And, you know, this year, at least for our experience, has been a little bit rougher than last year when it came to dwell times for cherries. It was, I think we were averaging at least a day, you know, waiting at sheds. It's a nightmare. So all of you guys, when you're grabbing your cherries at your local stores and you're enjoying them for the next few weeks, just know what went into that. And, I'm guilty of that because I love cherries. For cherries are like my favorite produce. So I can go eat a couple of pounds and then regret it an hour later. But, the first time I shipped a load of cherries 8 years ago, I had a different respect for them. They're a pain in the
Absolutely.
ass.
They are,
But
and they are not cheap.
no, that's definitely, if anybody gets into this game and you guys think that you're just going to cover a cherry load on the board, you got another thing coming. Like that is the worst decision that you're ever going to make, because you get $150,000 claim on one cherry load just because your temps were off.
Yep.
Yeah. Good luck recouping that from a carrier that you've never worked with before.
It doesn't take much.
No, not at all.
I mean, I've seen pretty much every cherry claim out there. And I mean, even just the ambient air infiltrating the trailer wall will be enough to throw a $150,000 claim at you. Yep. Nothing you can do about it. It is what it is, but it's part of shipping produce.
It's part of doing business when you're doing, strawberries can get I've seen some strawberry loads that are 125K plus too, those organic ones, Yeah. So big shout out to Erica and Sunny. Looks like they're on. Thanks for joining in, guys. Sunny's another great reefer broker. If you guys ever, I think his specialty is proteins. So anybody listening, need any help with meats, cheeses, dairy, reach out to Sunny. He's a great dude. But so what are you thinking for Q4 this year? Well, let's start. You watched Samantha's show this morning just as well as I do. Big shout out to Samantha Jones. If you guys don't follow her, check out her podcast, Meet Me for Coffee. She's a very, very intelligent woman. Has some great shows on there, but she had her big mid-year show this morning with, I think it was about 5 different industry experts. They kind of combed over everything. What did you think? Are you agreeing with some of the sentiment that this is going to be a very muted peak season in Q4 this year?
Part of me would say I agree on a macro scale, but from our niche, right, being produce, we know that Q4 is difficult. And so no matter what Van's doing, there are specific markets that can flip on their head overnight. So I would never write that off. I had kind of penciled in prior to joining that, obviously would be, you kind of come into that fall and winter bid season for the produce side specifically. I would anticipate there is going to be the typical disruption. There's a lot of non-controllables out there, weather being a big one, depending on how early snow starts to fall in the PNW. Yep. You get the passes start to close, things can really get difficult. The reality is that there's a lot of, summer birds that'll just avoid the area altogether. So capacity will naturally shrink. Yep. And so, we're kind of dependent, weather's not a good excuse because it is what it is. Like you can't predict that. There's no way we can say today what that's going to be. But in my experience, that is usually the catalyst that will start some, hypersensitivity to that specific region. I think California, like you said, has been pretty muted. And that's a good thing for kind of keeping rate stable. Something that, coming from the shipper side, stability is key. The last thing you want to deal with is volatility, whether it comes from setting retail costing or entering, annual agreements with a food distributor, for example. Like everyone kind of wants the price to be stable. They want to be able to predict and set margins on that pricing. So, best we can do is try to anticipate some of that change. I would say we've been kind of in this repetitive pattern year after year for the last 3 years where, that we're going to hit equilibrium and things are going to start to change and the market's going to turn and time comes and it kind of just resets all over again.
Yep.
And so, I would agree with them on a macro scale with, kind of removing all the geopolitical uncertainty that's out there. Demand's, what it is, supply pretty stable. So I think from a rate perspective, I would anticipate pretty flat through the end of the year. We'll see what happens in 26. Obviously, we don't have a crystal ball. If we did, we would be rich and not be here. Yeah. But, at the end of the day, we can take some of those, hits on the chin as they come. And our job for our customers is to keep pricing, stable and provide, good service and good communication, like all that. That's really where the focus should be right now, with pricing being what it's doing. It's pretty flat overall. Just that value add service is really where I think us as providers come in and add, something to their business, figure out what their incentives are, what their motivations and initiatives are for the upcoming year. That's from a partnership standpoint, right? Setting that long-term goal, being strategic with the partnerships. We can do that now, right? We have the ability. Pricing is not a huge concern. I don't think anyone thinks that, I probably should knock on wood, that this is going to change overnight. So this is where we can really double down on relationships.
100%. That's all. I mean, that's all that matters really long term, regardless of where the cycle's at, right? Like it's just relationship. Because at the end of the day, our job is to make their job less painful.
Absolutely.
That's all it is. Because logistics sucks. I love it. It's in my blood, but like it sucks from the fact that no matter what you project, no matter what data points you have, you're literally one storm away from having your entire world turned upside down. And I think it was Jim or Jason Miller this morning that was saying, weather's not that large of an issue. And I think I agree on a national level from that, except for, I remember a few years ago when we had that. Yeah, we've seen that Texas freeze that happened, all that sort of stuff. But regional specifics freight, I think, especially with what we do, the Pacific Northwest is a great example, like you brought up. That is like when that pass, I can't remember what that pass is called.
Snoqualmie, I-90.
Yeah, Snoqualmie. There you go. When that pass shuts down, good luck getting any trucks in and out of the Yakima Valley. Yeah, there's nothing you can do. And those orders aren't going to stop. They're just going to pile up. And as soon as that pass opens, you get a couple weeks of atrocious rates. I don't want to even tell you some of the stuff that we were paying a couple years ago.
I know.
You remember. Yeah. So it's like that stuff, you just have to deal with it. You got to pencil in. Q4 is always the biggest, unknown anytime you're trying to budget. You can pretty much like Q1, the beginning of Q1, you can still have a lot of storms like interfere with stuff, but not near as much as that first big storm. And anything going past Wyoming, we all know how that is, right? They shut down the freeway up there when the wind is over 10 miles an hour for good reason, because it's not very safe. But
it's always that first catalyst that creates the future doubt, right?
Exactly.
If you get burned by it the first time, you're not going to get burned again, right? Like you're going to avoid that situation, and that just compounds and compounds and compounds. The driver gets stuck on a load for a week because they can't move, right? Like they're not going to go right back, right? They're not going to sign up for that again.
Correct.
So you just start to see that deprecation of capacity over time. And that's not unique to just the P&W. It could be really anywhere. But yeah, I mean, I'd say on like that, micro scale, it is, weather can have a huge impact. Being from Texas, I lived through Harvey. I saw what that did to the supply chains in Texas. The freeze of a couple of years ago that shut down everything in February for over a week. Not typical for us down here, but it happened. And, if the highways are closed and you can't move, then there's product not going to get to the shelves.
Yep. And that's where your relationships really come into play, because you can't price in that stuff either, right? Like you can't price in the anomalies. You've got to price based off of, projections, historical stuff, all that fun shit that goes into our lovely pricing models. But you cannot err on the side of catastrophe. You really can't, or you're always going to price yourself out of business. And when those catastrophes happen, you just have to make sure that you have a relationship with people, because, I was on the shipper side for 12 years. You were on the shipper side for almost 20 years. We know that shit happens. We know that, and I'm not talking about the normal flat tire or reefer breakdown. We understand that shit happens too. Better not happen on every other load, because then we just know you're lying. But like that shit's going to be okay. But when you can get in front of a storm and you can say, hey guys, look what's going on. Give that shipper a heads up, give your customer a heads up, and make sure that you're planning directly with your customer. Don't just throw your arms up and be like, oh, sorry, the freeway's closed down. What am I going to do? Well,
absolutely.
Someone else is going to find a way. And then that someone else is going to get a lot more business from them as soon as this is all done.
That's right.
So be that problem solver.
Be the problem solver and be proactive, right?
100%.
I think something that a motto that we've lived by is you're only good as your last load.
100%.
Right? And that's, you fail a customer on a promo ad for the 4th of July drop, they're going to remember that, and they're going to look for alternatives. We want to give our customers reasons to want to work with us, not to not want to work with us.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, there's only so much we can control, but at the end of the day, it's all about being proactive, being communicative, following proper channels and pathways to make sure that, you know, we're being transparent about what's going on. I think the earlier you do that, the better.
Yep.
You brought up P&W. I remember overnight, I think it was winter 21-22, we had Apple loads out of Yakima going to the East Coast, and we had typically paid about 10 to 12 grand, depending on how many picks and what the dynamics of the OD pair was. But overnight, that jumped. We started getting $20,000 rates.
Yep. We were on some of those loads for you. Yeah, I remember that.
So we're like, okay, this is Apple's. Does it have to ship today? If not, we won't do it.
Yep.
And that's something, you know, that being, you know, if you're not sharing that information, right, there's very few out there that are going to take that $10,000 hit. It's not sustainable. And I think most good partners on the shipper side will understand that, right? Like, if this is a long-term partnership, you can't run them out of business because you force them to eat $40,000 in truck losses on apples, right?
Yep.
Like, the whole truck alone is only worth 20. You're not going to pay 100% of your cost for freight.
Yep. Yeah, that was in my 8 years. That was the only time we've actually cracked 20 grand on a load, and that was not a fun week. Not a fun week at all. That was brutal. But so let's touch really quick. We're going to be up on time here shortly, but so you made the transition from shipper to broker. That was a big thing for me. It was like there was a lot of eye-opening experiences because I used to be so anti-broker when I was on the shipper side, right? If you called me and you were a broker, I'd basically be like, nah, if you don't have assets, click, click, click. And now I get that all the time when I'm calling people. But I have a newfound respect as soon as I started in this game. Like, brokers actually go through a lot of shit. They are literally the punching bag, because if there's something wrong with the carrier's taking it out on you. If there's something wrong on the shipper side, the shipper's taking it out on you. If there's something wrong on the customer side, the customer's taking it out on you. And granted, we're not holding the wheel. I understand that. That's always what I get told by drivers, right? Is, oh, you guys make money and you don't do anything. We're the ones holding the wheel and backing up the trailer. And I'm like, man, if you guys saw just my tech bill alone every single month to make sure that I can flow information from, A to Z all the way through for every single customer that we work with. And in addition to taking care of all the carriers and paying before, the typical customer's going to pay. There's a great meme I saw today on LinkedIn about, the sales cycle of a brokerage. And at the very end is a little snail crawling. It says, your customer's day to pay. And there's a lot of that, there's a lot of large customers that are in net 60 and net 90.
Yeah.
You can't pay a carrier net 60 or net 90. So we're also the customer's bank account half the time. So there's so much that goes into being a broker. So just maybe kind of outline what was eye-opening to you and what's been some of the challenges since you've moved over.
Yeah. I mean, you nailed it. I think that hindsight's 20/20 on a lot of this, right? You can live and learn. I think the real opportunity to come over to this side, coming from the shipper background and the mentality that, cost savings, load optimization, utilization metrics, all these things kind of still apply on the other side. And that's where, my approach comes in to be like that kind of coach or that resource. Because I can say, yeah, I've done that. I did manage a $350 million spend annually in produce specifically. And so you're right. It's hard to crack the door because right now the shippers are in a position to be selective, right? They kind of are, creating and controlling the narrative on what that looks like for their mix. And I get that. I did the same thing. I inherited an 80% brokerage by volume versus 20% dedicated assets when I started in retail, and did have to claw that back to more of a 50-50 mix. Like, that was a huge initiative for me. So I do understand the reliability, some of the, touch points being minimized, eliminating the middleman in some regard. But the reality is there's not any less work on the brokerage side than there is from the asset side. If anything, there's more, right? Because you're not only managing communication for the shipper or the customer, or both in this example, but you're maintaining in produce specifically pulp temps, case counts, BOL verifications. That doesn't happen by accident, right? There's resources that you have to put to that to make sure that we are, that last line of defense for our customer base. We don't want to create claims. Everyone hates claims. They're the worst, right? We all agree. So anything we can do to make sure that we're heading off the unknowns by being proactive, being communicative, following pathways, appointment setting is as simple as it sounds, is getting more and more difficult as, shippers and receivers are integrating with multiple different platforms. And you might have to make 4 or 5 different calls or emails to get an appointment scheduled. So there's a lift that we're kind of taking off of the actual driver and dispatch when it comes to streamlining the end-to-end supply chain process, right? Like, we take ownership of the load well before, even though technically we don't take it till we load, but could be a week of planning going into that load that, it's not accounted for. And I think is sometimes, undersold a little bit on the lift that's required to make sure that things are operational, flowing smoothly. And so at the end of the day, there's tons of things that, you think until you are actually in the seat and experiencing it. And I think that's where, we have a very similar background. We relate to, a lot of the same things in our experience and how we unlock value on this side of the business and this side of the industry. That's been the biggest thing for me, right? A lot of things that, freight managers not thinking about. I get it. There's a million things that for them to do on a day-to-day basis that takes up time and commitment. So, you're not worrying about the little things. You're not worried about how your broker's setting appointments. You're not worried about the SOPs that go into play, the protocols at loading, the communication back for, quantity discrepancies or, pulp temps being off or elevated, trying to mitigate, claims risk. Those type of things are, happen in the background. And I think those that are really good at it are going to succeed moving forward.
100%. I mean, we always talk about communication being the number one thing, and communication is not just picking up a phone and calling somebody about anything. It's understanding what their needs are, and they vary between customers. We've got customers, I'm sure you guys are in the same boat too, that want you to track 100% of the time. They want to know exactly where their truck's at 2:00 in the morning. They want to be able to just hop on, click a little link and see where the truck's at. And then I've got other customers that straight up tell me, let me know it picked up on time. Let me know it's going to deliver on time. Everything else in between is all up to you. That's what I pay you for. Right.
Yep.
And, I was taught a long time ago too, that there's broker freight and there's freight that makes more sense to always be on assets. And as a broker, you got to understand that too, because you might get like a 5,000 lane RFP. You've seen some of those. And you're like, oh my God, this thing is so huge. And this is a big daunting task. And it's like, yeah, but realistically, most customers are going to be closer to that 70, 30, 80, 20 split. Most of their freight, if it's the same repetitive stuff that's regional, that's less than 500 miles, that makes most of the time more sense to be on assets. A lot of your OTR stuff, for some reason, it does make more sense with, especially out of California. But I think it's because the ratio of large fleets versus small fleets in California is different than national. National average, I think, is about 80% small fleets, right? 80% of the capacity nationally is on small fleets, which is 5 trucks or less. But in California, I do believe it's a lot higher on small fleets. You get a lot more like 2, 3, 4 truck fleets. Obviously, those guys are going to have a very hard time getting a contract. And that's where brokers come into play, is we're able to tap into those assets and those carriers. And quite frankly, on the shipper side, the last thing I wanted to do, I wanted to manage 20 to 25, good carriers and brokers. I did not want to manage 500, 600, 700 small carriers. It might have saved me a little bit of money, but at the end of the day, I've got to be hounding those guys for updated insurance. I've got to make sure that those guys are able to tap into my TMS for updates. I would rather just go to somebody like you or somebody like us and just say, look, This is the 20% of the pie that you guys get. And, this is my expectations, and let's run with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just think that there's so much, and that's why I think that produce is so broker specific. It's broker heavy, is because it is much harder to move than, say, corn pops or toilet paper. I mean, a lot of that stuff you can do drop trailers, you can pick it up, you can drop it in your yard for a day. Nobody cares if toilet paper is going to sit in your yard for a day. Produce, on the other hand, you can't do that stuff. This is like,
Right.
your dwell times through the roof. I mean, the same culprits in the game. One of them's, TF. I'm not going to mention their names, and, a couple others that when a driver sees that, they're not going to give you a market rate because they know they're going to be sitting there for 10 to 12 hours.
Yep.
So produce is just a different animal. I think perishables in general is a different animal, but I do think that there's a lot of freight that makes more sense to be given to a broker, and there's a lot more freight that makes sense to just be given to assets. And as a broker, you need to understand that as well. Temper your expectations. Go after what makes sense for you, for your network. Do not be a load board chaser where you're just going to take every single lane and hope that you can find capacity on the load boards. I mean, that honestly, in a market that's a little bit different than ours right now, you can probably get away with that, quite frankly. But in a normal market, that's the worst thing you can do as a broker. Absolutely.
Agreed. Yeah,
So,
no, you don't want to rely on load boards. Like our thing is we want to be pre-sold, 90% pre-sold. Like we don't want to be living in the day of, right? Because as unfortunate as it is, who's available outside of like just the late unload or whoever, most of these good, preferred partners are going to be, they know where their trucks are 2 weeks out.
exactly.
Right? They're pre-planned. They know what they're doing. If you're relying on day of recovery is always going to be a thing. Trucks break down, loads get rejected, things happen, right? And we can mitigate some of that, but at the end of the day, like, work ahead. Like I said earlier, the more we can do being proactive, the better results we're going to see.
Yep. And the more repetitive carriers you get, the better they understand you as a company, and they better understand your customers, right? Like, the best thing you can do is have a driver who has a good relationship with the guard shack and the receivers.
That's right.
They make your lives so much easier as a broker. Absolutely, so much easier.
Yeah, they know the game. They've been there. They've done it. Increasing the your carrier depth is important as well, from a partnership standpoint. It also heads off fraud, which is a big thing we didn't really get to touch on, with insurance premiums going crazy. That's a huge factor that I think will be at the forefront for the coming years, as we continue to kind of navigate this uncertain environment, from the new, fraudsters are always ahead of the game, right? They're always first to act. And so the more that we try to work ahead and anticipate that, comes back to that, partnership mentality, not for customers only, but also on our carrier partners.
100%. I mean, I can't count how many carriers have reached out the last, I would say, 3 or 4 months and said that, hey, my X, Y, and Z got hacked. Right. And so these bad actors are always a step ahead of us. They're smarter than us. Unfortunately, half the time they are. And that's just reality. And if they actually spent half of the time that they spend on trying to, be a fraudster, into something that's actually like a real job, they'd probably be successful. Yeah, they'd be great. But until certain government entities make it a lot more painful for these guys, the fraud's going to run rampant. And it'd be great to have you back on the show. I think I'm going to do a fraud episode probably with Cassandra Gaines over at Carrier Sure in the fall, right before peak season starts, for, because there's what we do. It's a lot hard, I guess not harder, but it's a lot less profitable to steal a load of apples than it is to steal a load of TVs.
Right.
Or, food and beverage, the number one culprit is always energy drinks, because the secondhand market's huge. You can go to any flea market, you can go to any fair or anything like that, and there's always somebody selling Red Bulls for $2, right?
That's right.
So if you're able to steal a load of Red Bulls or Monsters or something like that, send it to a cross dock, and that entire load's yours after that, it's all profit. And there's no way they can track that. So that's the biggest thing. But it'd be great to have you back on, because you do have a very unique perspective given your background on fraud and now where you're at. So maybe we can get a panel together and have a good fraud discussion in the next few months.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, we are out of time. Ryan, what's the best way for the audience to reach out to you?
They can hit me up on LinkedIn's probably the easiest. Freshfreight.com website. I think that either one of those, I'll get it. I'd say let's start there and look forward to hearing from you all. Appreciate the time, Cody.
Cool. Yeah, likewise, buddy. It's always a pleasure talking with you. You've got a lot of insight and had a lot of fun. So thanks everybody for watching, and I will see you guys in a couple weeks. Thank you.
Take it easy.